How do you feel? Have you reflected on anything yet?
I went to meet my husband, who threw me out of the house after believing his stepchild's lies. And he acted all high and mighty. He looks down on me without knowing anything, and I just laughed and responded, "No, I haven't reflected at all. Now, please sign here." I handed him the divorce papers and documents I received from the lawyer right in front of him. My husband, looking calm, signed the divorce papers. When he saw the documents, he froze in shock. His stepchild also panicked when they realized that their lies had been exposed and when they learned the truth. My name is Mary. I'm a 52-year-old office worker living with my husband and his son. I married my husband a year ago, and his son, Jim, is unmarried but already an adult working full-time. I didn't adopt Jim, so in my eyes, he was just like a stranger. I actually wanted him to leave the house, but Jim refused to leave his childhood home.
My mother died 5 years ago. This is the house where I lived with her, so I don't want to leave.
That's how Jim explained why he wouldn't move out of the house. His biological mother passed away 5 years ago, just as my late husband did. I also have an adult daughter, Emma, and she supported my decision to remarry. "Don't worry about Jim. Once he gets married, he'll move out." When I consulted her about Jim, my daughter didn't seem to mind the situation.
"Jim will eventually become independent."
My husband said similar things, as if he wanted Jim to become independent soon. I could understand Jim's feelings about not wanting to leave the house he shared with his mother, but his defiant attitude toward me was unbearable.
"My mom was a better cook, but I guess I'll eat your terrible food since I have no choice."
While eating the meal I cooked, Jim sighed and muttered things like that. I didn't know how great a cook his mother was, but his words made me feel depressed. If my cooking is so terrible, he should just make his own food or buy something. But he never did. Frustrated, I consulted my husband. "Jim doesn't seem to like my cooking. What should I do?"
"You don't have to force him to eat your cooking. Just stop making food for him."
I was seriously worried, but my husband answered indifferently.
"You don't have to cater to Jim's whims. If he doesn't want it, just stop making meals for him."
My husband said it so simply, but if I didn't prepare meals for Jim, he would get angry.
"Why don't I have a meal? You married my dad, so it's only natural you prepare my meals too."
Right after I married my husband, Jim would often eat out for dinner, so I only prepared meals for my husband and me. But when Jim came home and saw that there was no food for him, he would complain. When I hastily prepared his meal, he would immediately throw sarcastic comments at me.
"I should have just eaten out if this was the dinner waiting for me. Why did Dad even marry someone like you?"
I hoped my husband would defend me, but he just disappeared from the kitchen, unwilling to confront Jim. Before we got married, the plan was for Jim to live separately, but he showed no signs of moving out. My husband and I met through a mutual friend. We both lost our spouses to illness and had adult children, so we thought living together would keep us from feeling lonely.
"I was thinking of moving out of the house too, so let's live quietly together."
When we got engaged, Jim smiled and said that to me. But in reality, Jim didn't move out and kept coming up with reasons to stay. He would sometimes say he couldn't afford to live alone, or that he didn't want to leave his childhood home. Jim worked full-time, and if he didn't live lavishly, I thought he could manage living alone.
"He's trying to rent a fancy apartment. I've told him to find something cheap, but he won't listen."
My husband seemed frustrated, talking as if they had discussed it. But when I brought up the topic of moving with Jim, he snapped at me.
"Don't act all high and mighty like my mom. Dad said I didn't have to move out, so why are you saying anything?"
My husband told me he'd been encouraging Jim to move out, but it was clear that wasn't true. Shortly after we married, I realized my husband wasn't as trustworthy as I thought. He was kind and gentle, but I started to wonder if he was just indecisive. Worried, I called my daughter for advice. "Maybe he just really loves living at home, or he genuinely can't afford to move out. If it were me, I'd be considerate and not live with newlyweds." My daughter said that, and I agreed. Jim had a lot of clothes, shoes, and even collected luxury watches. Even though he disliked me, he would have me clean his room, and I could tell he was spending money lavishly. I never told my husband, but I also saw collection notices from credit card companies in Jim's room. According to my husband, Jim had never spent money like this when his mother was alive, but after inheriting her estate, he changed. Jim's late mother came from a wealthy family, so she left behind a substantial inheritance.
She had lots of assets.
My husband casually mentioned this. The only heirs were my husband and Jim. After inheriting his mother's wealth, Jim became reckless with his spending, buying luxury clothes and other items.
I noticed it and tried to tell him, but I didn't press it. I thought he was coping with his mother's death by shopping, so I couldn't say much.
Hearing that, I could understand, but I also felt that as a parent, he should have been more firm. My late husband didn't have much in the way of assets, so my daughter didn't inherit a large sum. When the inheritance process was over, I told my daughter about the small amount, and she laughed. If I had inherited a large amount, I'd probably waste it all. It's a good thing Dad didn't leave much behind. Watching Jim waste the large inheritance he got from his mother, I realized my daughter was right. Still, when my daughter found out about how much Jim had inherited, she couldn't help but say her true feelings. I know I said all that, but honestly, I would have been happy to get a big inheritance too. We both laughed. I had hoped to enjoy my golden years with my husband, but things weren't going as planned. My husband wasn't the man I thought he was, and Jim still hadn't moved out. I started venting my frustrations to my daughter. I have some good news for you. I got proposed to. I've been with him for a while, so of course I said yes. Since getting remarried, I hadn't had much good news, so I was thrilled to hear my daughter's announcement. I knew she had been dating someone, and I was wondering when she would get married. Congratulations! I'm sure your father in heaven is happy too. As I said that, memories of my late husband came flooding back. He worried about her future until his final moments, and I'm sure he's relieved now. I'm going to introduce my fiancé to you. But do I have to introduce him to Brian? He's just your second husband, and he has nothing to do with me. My daughter was hesitant about meeting Brian, but I told her just to greet him. Unlike Jim, my daughter didn't live with us, and she wasn't adopted. She had told her fiancé about her late father and about my remarriage. Since I'd been venting to her about my husband and Jim, she didn't have a great opinion of them. Just explain the situation to him yourself. I don't really want to meet them, she said with an awkward smile. When I told my husband about our daughter's wedding, he barely reacted. He wasn't interested in my daughter, so he seemed indifferent.
Why don't you just divorce Dad and live with your daughter? You probably hate living with me and Dad anyway.
I was shocked by Jim's sudden remark. My husband didn't get angry, he just left the room as usual. Jim wanted to use my daughter's wedding as an excuse to drive me out. But I didn't plan on living with my daughter and interfering with her newlywed life. Annoyed by Jim, I snapped back at him. Don't you have someone special? Why don't you get married and give your father and mother peace of mind? Jim scowled and walked away, even more irritated. He never talked about any romantic relationships, and I didn't know if he had a partner. Brian didn't seem to care either, so we never discussed Jim's future. Now that my daughter was getting married, I wondered what would happen if Jim also decided to get married. I hoped that marriage would finally get him to leave, but I worried that he might suggest living here with his wife. The thought hadn't occurred to me before, but it filled me with dread. Do you think Jim will want to stay here after getting married? I asked Brian when Jim wasn't around, but he brushed it off.
Just leave it to Jim. I don't care either way.
He seemed to have given up on the idea of Jim moving out, and his indifferent attitude bothered me. Although there was no concrete talk of Jim getting married yet, I hated how Brian wouldn't take a clear stance on anything. Not long after, I finally met Emma's fiancé. I asked Brian if he wanted to join the introduction, but he flatly refused.
I don't care about that. You don't need to invite me to the wedding either.
I had expected that response from him, but I was still disappointed he didn't even congratulate her. I ignored him and went to meet Emma's fiancé. He turned out to be a wonderful person, and I felt relieved. He was around Jim's age, but he was much more mature and reliable. I was impressed that my daughter had chosen such a great man. You found yourself a wonderful person. I'm so relieved. I said that to them, and they smiled happily. When I remarried Brian, I also thought I had met someone wonderful, but it turned out to be far from that. Emma's fiancé lived alone and can do all the household chores. Compared to Jim, who didn't lift a finger, he seemed incredibly dependable. Brian didn't help around the house either, and Jim seemed to think household chores were women's work. I was surprised by their old-fashioned attitudes, and I was relieved my daughter didn't choose someone like Jim. If I had been Jim's biological mother, I would have made him do housework. I started worrying about what would happen if Jim stayed here forever. Brian and I were still healthy, but I wasn't sure if Jim would take care of us when we needed it. I was sure Jim wouldn't take care of me, and I doubted he would even take care of his father. Noticing my worried expression, Emma asked with concern, "Why do you look so worried all of a sudden? Are you unhappy about our wedding?" She joked, and I decided to tell her about Jim.
"I've heard about Jim from your daughter, and don't worry, we'll take good care of you, so you don't need to worry about them anymore. If things don't go well with your husband and his son, you can always come live with us."
Hearing that from Emma's fiancé made me feel incredibly relieved. I ended up having a long, enjoyable conversation with them. When I returned home late, Jim immediately threw a complaint at me.
"A housekeeper shouldn't be late. Dad and I are starving."
Jim called me a housekeeper, but Brian just pretended not to hear it. After seeing Emma's mature fiancé, Brian and Jim seemed even more pathetic to me. I wanted to tell them that if they were hungry, they could cook for themselves, but I held my tongue and began preparing dinner. As much as Jim annoyed me, I was also angry at Brian. Recently, Brian had been spending his days off out of the house, and he was rarely home. Jim would wake up in the afternoon, eat, and then leave, so I was often home alone. While I preferred being alone to having Jim around, it felt like there was no point in being married if he wasn't even home. We had talked about spending the rest of our lives together, but he was doing whatever he wanted. "Where do you go every weekend? Take me with you sometimes."
"I'm not going out to have fun. A friend's mother is in the hospital, so I'm helping them out."
He looked troubled as he answered. "Every week? That's a bit suspicious," so I decided to ask him, "Is this friend a woman?" Brian panicked and denied it, but seeing how flustered he was only made me more suspicious. After that, Brian continued going out on his days off, and our relationship deteriorated further. Noticing the tension between us, Jim seemed delighted as he approached me.
"Dad probably regrets marrying an old lady like you. Maybe he wishes he'd married someone younger. You're going to get cheated on and kicked out, poor thing."
I was irritated by Jim's comments, but given Brian's behavior, I couldn't help but wonder if he really was having an affair. It seemed like Jim didn't know the truth and was just saying it to upset me.
"Why don't you just give up on Dad and leave before things get messy?"
Jim's words made me realize that I needed to investigate Brian's actions. But I was so angry at Jim for being so spiteful, so I snapped back at him. "If I leave, who's going to cook and clean for you? You don't do any housework, do you?" Jim glared at me and stormed off. If I left, Jim would probably do nothing. Before I moved in, Brian had done all the housework himself, but most of their meals came from a supermarket. The house was a mess when I moved in, and I cleaned it up. If I left, the house would probably go back to being filthy. Brian wasn't home enough to handle housework, and I wondered if he planned to marry his mistress and have her take over my role. I didn't even know for sure if he was cheating, but I was already imagining the worst. I thought about calling Emma to talk about it. Just then, Emma called me. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" She sounded serious, so I got worried and went to her place. Her fiancé was there too. "What's the matter? Don't tell me you're calling off the wedding." I asked anxiously, but they both smiled awkwardly. "Why would we cancel the wedding? This is about you, not us." Relieved that it wasn't about their wedding, I was surprised to hear that it involved me. My daughter's fiancé showed me his phone and asked,
"Is this your husband, Brian?"
I didn't recognize him at first, but the woman with him called him by that name, so it caught my attention. Emma pointed to the young woman standing next to a man who looked like Brian. After looking closely, I realized the man was indeed Brian, and I recognized his clothes. This picture was taken at a wedding venue. They were discussing their own wedding. Jack looked shocked, and I was even more stunned. Brian had no children besides Jim, so the woman next to him couldn't have been his daughter. I couldn't believe Brian was talking about getting married when he was already married to me. And the woman was much younger than me, which made it all the more shocking. "That woman looks far too young to be Jim's girlfriend, doesn't she?" Emma asked, and I recalled Brian's suspicious behavior. I had suspected he might be cheating, but I never imagined he would be with someone so much younger. "I haven't heard anything about Jim getting married. Maybe they're keeping it a secret, but I doubt Jim would tell me anyway." Emma and I both thought it was unlikely that Jim would share such news with me. Brian would probably keep it quiet, just as he had shown no interest in Emma's wedding. I suspect this woman might be his mistress. I never thought he'd be involved with someone so young. Hearing this, both Emma and Jack were visibly shocked. I told them everything about Brian's recent suspicious behavior and how I had planned to investigate.
Your husband is awful. We need to properly investigate and make sure he takes responsibility.
You need to divorce him immediately, Mom. I was determined to leave him, but like Emma's fiancé said, we needed to gather evidence first. Let's hire a private investigator right away. Jack started looking up detective agencies. Don't worry about your future, Mom. You can come live with us. Jack nodded in agreement, and I felt reassured. After talking with them for a while, I returned home, feeling determined to stay calm and wait for the investigation. When I got home, Jim immediately started complaining.
Hurry up and make dinner. Housekeepers shouldn't be out so late.
His attitude irritated me, but I started making dinner as usual. I had already decided that once I had proof of Brian's affair, I would leave. But I didn't want to give Jim the satisfaction of seeing me suffer. I knew Jim would struggle without me, but that wasn't my problem anymore. If Brian remarried, Jim would have to rely on his new wife, and he wouldn't be able to treat her the same way he treated me. When Brian came home, I asked him casually, "Will you be attending our daughter's wedding? They're having it at a prestigious venue." When I mentioned the name of the venue, Brian's face stiffened for a moment. "You've heard of that venue, haven't you?" I asked him, and though he denied it, he was clearly flustered. Seeing his reaction, I became more certain that he was the man in the photo. I decided not to push the subject further for now, fearing he might catch on to my suspicions. Brian changed the subject, bringing up Jim.
Jim hasn't asked you for money, has he? He's been struggling financially lately.
Jim had never asked me for money. He saw me as nothing more than a housekeeper and didn't expect help from me. According to Brian, Jim had been pestering him for money, despite inheriting a large sum from his mother.
He blew through all the money from his mother's inheritance. Now he's asking me for money.
I thought about mentioning the debt collection notices I had seen while cleaning Jim's room, but I couldn't bring myself to tell Brian. I didn't feel like confiding in a man who was likely cheating on me, and I was afraid of Jim's reaction if he found out I had seen the notices. He'd probably scream at me and say something like, "Stay out of my business, housekeeper." I simply told Brian that Jim hadn't asked me for money.
Can't you tell him to stop wasting money?
I was stunned by Brian's request. Jim doesn't see me as anything but a housekeeper. If I tell him, he'll just get angry. You're his father, so you should talk to him. Brian wasn't satisfied and kept pleading with me.
Don't be so cold, please. I'm not good at dealing with tough conversations.
Brian was trying to push the responsibility onto me, and I felt a wave of disappointment. I felt both disappointed and suspicious of Brian, who couldn't even talk to his own son. The next day, Brian kept asking me,
"Have you talked to Jim about the money yet? What did he say?"
He was insistent, even though it was clear he didn't want to confront Jim himself. When I told him I hadn't spoken to Jim yet, Brian got angry.
"What are you doing? You need to talk to Jim about this right away."
I was fed up with his constant nagging, so I reluctantly approached Jim. "Jim, your father is worried about your spending. He asked me to remind you to be more careful with money." I tried to be as non-confrontational as possible, but Jim exploded in anger.
"Who do you think you are, housekeeper? It's my money, and I'll spend it however I want. It's none of your business."
I could see why Brian had avoided the conversation. Jim was impossible to reason with. But I wished Brian, as Jim's father, would step up and handle it himself. I began to imagine that Brian didn't care about Jim anymore and was only focused on his affair. Jim glared at me with hatred.
"I'll get you kicked out of this house. Just wait."
I knew that once I had proof of Brian's infidelity, I'd leave on my own terms, but Jim's words still stung. A few days later, Emma called to tell me the results of the investigation. "Mom, we have the proof." She asked me to meet her and Jack at a local restaurant. Was it true? Did he really cheat on me? Emma was furious as she answered, "Yes, it's true. He's been seeing a woman who's much younger than you. They're even looking for a new house together." Jack handed me the investigation report, which was filled with undeniable evidence. There were countless photos of Brian with his mistress. "You need to divorce him right away."
"I agree. This woman seems very suspicious. You should make sure you don't get caught up in whatever she's planning."
I was confused by his comment, so Emma explained. "This woman has been spending a lot of money, buying luxury goods and living extravagantly."
"There's also a possibility she's seeing other men besides your husband."
Emma nodded as her fiancé continued.
"It seems like your husband is being taken advantage of. She might be planning to take his money and leave him."
Hearing this made me realize how deeply Brian had fallen for this woman's schemes.
"They've already been to the wedding venue, and she might have taken money from him for wedding preparations and a new house. You need to divorce him before she takes everything."
His words gave me a sense of urgency. I had to act quickly. After discussing the next steps with Emma and her fiancé, I returned home with the investigation report in hand. When I arrived, I found Jim and Brian talking in the living room.
"Mary, come here. We need to talk."
Brian called me over with a serious expression. I thought it was the perfect opportunity to confront him. Jim was smirking as he glanced at me.
"You've been seeing a younger guy, haven't you? Dad saw you at a family restaurant with him today."
Jim showed me a picture on his phone of me with Emma's fiancé.
"Caught red-handed. How embarrassing. Dating someone the same age as your daughter?"
Jim was gloating, but I didn't let it affect me. "That's Emma's fiancé, and she was with us at the restaurant." But Brian wouldn't listen.
"Jim caught you in the act. You've been cheating on me, haven't you?"
He believed Jim's story without question.
"Dad, kick her out. Let's live together again like before." "I agree with Jim. Leave this house, Mary. We'll deal with the divorce and money later."
I could hardly believe the arrogance in Brian's voice. He really thought I was the guilty one. I felt like laughing at how clueless he was. I wasn't going to argue with them now. It wasn't worth it. "All right, I'll leave. We can discuss the divorce and financial matters later," Jim yelled as I walked toward the door.
"Make us dinner before you go. I'm hungry."
Even at that moment, all he cared about was food. I ignored him and left the house with the investigation report in my bag. I went straight to Emma's house and explained what had happened.
"I can't believe they mistook me for your lover."
Jack shook his head in disbelief.
"That man is delusional."
I knew I had made the right choice by leaving. I asked Emma and Jack to help me with the divorce proceedings, and they agreed. Just to be sure, I asked them, "Are you sure you'll be okay with me living with you after you're married?" "Of course, Mom. We want you to live with us." I was grateful for their kindness.
"We should hire a lawyer to handle the divorce and alimony. Your husband might refuse to pay if things get complicated."
I agreed. It was best to leave it to a professional. 3 weeks passed before Brian finally contacted me.
"Let's meet and discuss things at the house. Bring the divorce papers."
I knew he'd been preparing for this. On the day of the meeting, I arrived with Emma, Jack, and our lawyer.
"Why didn't you come alone?"
Brian panicked when he saw us. "You never said I had to come alone." The house was a mess. It had only been 3 weeks, but it was already filthy.
"You still haven't learned your lesson, have you? Even with all these people, you'll still pay us alimony."
I couldn't help but laugh at how clueless he still was. "I haven't learned anything because I've done nothing wrong. Here, sign these." I handed Brian the divorce papers. He froze when he saw the documents.
"Why am I paying alimony? You're the one who cheated."
He showed the same blurry photo again.
"We have proof of your affair." "That's me in the photo. The woman with me is my fiancée, her daughter."
Jim was speechless.
"I don't believe it. We'll take this to court." "Go ahead."
The lawyer handed Jim and Brian the investigator's report.
"Dad, you were cheating on her? There's actual proof?"
Brian was too ashamed to answer.
"I can't pay alimony. I'm broke. I'm in debt. And I borrowed money for the wedding and honeymoon."
Jim was in shock.
"You're not remarrying, are you? I don't want to lose half of your inheritance."
Jim's true motive became clear.
"You've already spent all of Mom's inheritance?"
Brian nodded, looking defeated, collapsed in disbelief.
"Dad, can't you lend me some money? You've got some left, right?"
Brian begged Jim for help, but Jim had none to give. Jim had already burned through his own inheritance. I reminded them, "Jim, I found debt collection notices in your room. At your age, asking your mom to clean your room is just embarrassing." Jim went quiet. "Stop pretending to be a victim. Jim is an adult now, and he should take responsibility for his actions." The lawyer presented the alimony documents, and Bryant reluctantly signed them.
I hope you can afford to keep paying after you remarry.
Brian paled as Emma's fiancé continued.
I heard your mistress is spending your money and seeing other men.
Brian turned white as a sheet. He frantically tried to call her, but she didn't pick up.
Mary, I'm sorry. Don't leave us. Dad's never home, and I'm tired of eating junk food.
Jim begged, but I refused. Ask your father's new wife. You'll have a young housekeeper soon enough. Jim gave up and asked for money instead. We're not giving you anything.
You can use the house as collateral for a loan.
I reminded them the house was rented, not owned. As we were leaving, Brian begged.
Mary, wait. Don't divorce me yet.
I turned him down coldly. Remember when you asked if I'd reflected on my actions? You should be the one reflecting. We left him and Jim behind and headed straight to City Hall to file for divorce. After the divorce, I moved in with Emma and Jack. It was a bit cramped, but we were moving to a bigger place soon. They had already planned for me to live with them. I was grateful for their kindness. Don't look so sad. You got away from that awful man. Emma's words helped lift my spirits. I focused on preparing for her wedding and our upcoming move.
I heard your ex-husband got scammed.
I was surprised, and Jack explained.
He tried to get a refund from the wedding venue, and they told him he had already been paid.
My ex-husband had given his mistress a large sum of money for a wedding that would never happen. He had been completely scammed.
He even borrowed money for a honeymoon that will never happen.
I wasn't surprised. I worried whether he would continue paying alimony. Jim called me a few days later.
Mom, help me. Dad moved out, and I have nowhere to go.
I reminded him, I'm not your mother, we're not related, and I've divorced your father. He kept begging, but I stood firm. Take this as a chance to grow up and live on your own. He yelled at me in frustration.
I can't believe you're abandoning me.
I asked him how much debt my ex-husband had.
Dad lost everything and borrowed more than I did. He's buried in debt.
I felt both satisfaction and sadness hearing this. Jim's mother had left him a substantial inheritance, and he wasted it all. Jim still called me for help occasionally, but I refused every time. Eventually, Jack told Jim he would report him to the police if he kept harassing me. That finally scared Jim off. Soon after, my ex-husband called me.
Mary, let's get back together. I'm all alone now. Let's start over.
I couldn't believe he was still so selfish. You didn't break up with her. She took your money and ran. He didn't give up.
Let's work together to pay off the debts. You don't even need alimony.
I warned him. If you call me again, I'll report you to the police. That was the last time I heard from him. He still paid alimony each month, though I suspected it was to stay in my good graces. I was glad the nightmare was over and could focus on Emma's wedding and our future. Life with Emma and her husband was peaceful, and soon we got more good news. Emma was pregnant. I was thrilled to become a grandmother and wanted to help them as much as I could. Jack was a kind, responsible man, and I knew he would be a great father. Life was finally looking up, and I was determined to make the most of it with my family.